The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.
Man, it's been a long time. I shouldn't have left you without a dope beat to step two. I'm sorry. I couldn't resist. Welcome, folks, to the Benjamin Dixon Show. It has been some time. It's been over a month since I put an episode out, and I have been putting out daily videos about 4 to 5 times a week, 3 to 4 or 5 times a week for our patrons. So if you want to get regular updates, go to patreon.com/the BPD Show. Today's episode is a long one. I had a chance to speak at length with Professor Matt Sienkiewicz, who has been a regular on my show. He's hosted the show in my absence. He may as well just be my co-host at this point. But we had an opportunity to talk about this evolution of white supremacy. And we used Ben-Shapiro as a proxy, or not even a proxy, right? He's a direct example of where white supremacy has gone in this country. And most people, at first glance, you'd be like, well, Ben-Shapiro's a Jew, so how can he be a white supremacist? Well, Candace Owens is black. How could she be a white supremacist? And she, in fact, is a person who protects and promotes the ideology of white supremacy. So we get into that conversation in great detail, in some uncomfortable detail. So buckle up. It's a long episode, but listen in. And also, there is a bonus clip that I think is phenomenal that you should go to patreon.com/the BPD Show to get the bonus clip between me and Professor Sienkiewicz, where we talk about Ben-Shapiro, we talk about A. Philip Randolph, and we talk about Marcus Garvey. We talk about nativism. We talk about how nativism leans towards collaboration with white supremacy. And that's about as much teaser as I can give. Go to patreon.com/the BPD Show. Let's get to the show. It's been a while since I've done the show, and so therefore, Matt, it's been a while since you've been on the show. Welcome back.
Oh, thanks for having me, Ben. It's good to see the show back going.
Yeah, it takes a little time. Funny, quiet as it's kept, and quite hilariously, you've actually been on this journey that I've gone through in a very intimate way in the background. So you know everything that's going on about everything. And so there's not much that we can really say here, but boy, the stories we could tell.
Yeah, no, I know where some of the bones are buried. That is true.
Right.
But looking forward to pressing forward.
Yeah. And that's, and the reason I brought that up even is to mention that sometimes it takes a minute to get your wits back about you and to get your grounding and to hit the ground running again. And so here we are, my first episode, my first full episode, probably since, So let's talk about something that you and I talk about often. And what brings this to mind really is Ben-Shapiro. Ben-Shapiro just being probably the most popular person right now who fits the mold of what we're going to talk about. And it's this phenomenon that really blows me away and oftentimes is used as a way of adding confusion to our discussion. And that phenomenon is of seeing Jewish people of the Jewish faith, aligning with the far right in the United States. And actually, I think it's happening internationally, and aligning with the far right in the United States and internationally oftentimes means being in the same block, if nothing else, like, being forgiving. It's being in the same sentence as not only white supremacists, but all out neo-Nazis. I want to pause there and let you jump in, and then we'll kind of create a framework for the conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing that needs to be stated is this is absolutely a minority, a tiny minority of the Jewish world, which has those sympathies. It gets a little more complicated when you take it outside of the United States, but in the U.S., I mean, overwhelmingly the Jewish population is liberal, and finds the positions of somebody like Shapiro not right at best.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's just the first thing you have to get out there, and that's true on a global level. But if we talk in the U.S., we have the data to back it up very cleanly.
Right.
So that's the first thing to keep in mind. I think I would throw towards you to just make a comparative note, there's always an interest in that minority figure who will align with, Candace Owens
exactly
comes to mind. So, I'm totally, the conversation needs to be had as long as we make sure to frame it. And this is not a Jewish phenomenon by any stretch, that there is a, in other words, everybody's always looking for somebody
misery
out, right?
Misery loves company, Matt. you just
right.
had to throw Candace Owens in here, but no, that's the proper framework, I think. And what's go ahead.
Yeah, it's partially. There's more to it, right? There's more to it. Certainly, there's a element where you have to discuss Israel. There's an element where you have to discuss the very small but very influential neoconservative movement and the role that prominent intellectual Jews played in that. I think that I think that needs to be framed a little bit in the context of just, there is not, it's tough to find an important American intellectual movement in which you don't have, a disproportional representation of Jewish figures left or right. Yeah. So they're going to come across the spectrum. So it's not simply, Candace Owens is worth mentioning just in that I just want to be clear. It's not like a unique situation. However, you're right. There's some history that we can discuss that pulls at the more complicated parts.
Well, yeah. So we're already unpacking or setting up the layers that have to be discussed to have a robust conversation about this. But I agree with you. I think Candace Owens is probably the best example from the Black community to be compared or juxtaposed to Ben-Shapiro. They are both in a very minuscule minority, not just a minority, but a very, very small slither of the Black community, just like Ben-Shapiro represents he might be one of 5, right? I don't know the actual numbers, but I agree that it's a very small amount of people who carry that white nationalist sentiment. Even if it's not directly, they carry it indirectly. And what I consider Candace Owens to be is a collaborator of color, right? And white supremacy, neo-Nazism, just the far right conservatism in this country, because unfortunately, all of those different paradigms or all those different ideologies are merging underneath Donald Trump. But they always seem to be able to find collaborators of color or collaborators of different ethnicities and faiths. And the important part of this is there's many parts that are important, but the thing that jumps out the most to me is the sophistication, if I can use that in regards to white supremacy, the sophistication of white supremacy, the ability of it to evolve and to spread its ideology. If you go back into American history, white supremacy or whiteness in this country did not even include the Irish people. It did not include Germans. It was very Anglo-Saxon. It didn't include Catholics. And now we see an evolution of white supremacy in this country that expands all the way out to basically anyone of any color, of any faith, of any ethnicity, any sexuality, who's willing to support and defend white supremacy. What do you think about that?
Yeah, the white supremacy question with somebody like Shapiro, it's obviously it's as complicated as you're suggesting. It's easy to get tied up in it. The question of Jews as white in the United States is, this is as you note, right? If you look to the turn of the 20th century, that's pretty clear that we don't have a version of whiteness that includes Jews, right?
Right.
And there's a process by which you can look at which, light-skinned, white-skinned minorities. And it's really important to note that, many Jews do not have such skin, right, and are not eligible. As a quick aside, over 50% of, so we're going to try to, we hopefully won't, but people often will just try to map it back to Israel, right? Over 50% of the Jews in Israel are from the Middle East and North Africa, right? Jew does not mean white on a global level. It doesn't mean white on an American level either. However, right, there are certainly Jews whose skin color sort of makes them eligible to, be part of the expansion of whiteness. There's some ugly history there when we look at the tactics that groups that were being oppressed but had an access to potentially become white used. So blackface is a big part of this history.
Yeah.
Right. If you look at early 20th century, I mean, who is it that's putting on blackface? It's Irish Americans, it's Jewish Americans, it's actually Black Americans in a really complicated but history. But I mean, one of the things about an Irishman or a Jew putting on blackface, right, is you can do that and then you change and you show, oh, you must be white, right? Like the fact that you can transform to black, and so there's this process. With Jews, there's a really complicated element of it in which you have the physical appearance elements, but then you have the practice elements of it and the other ways in which you can be visibly different. And in American Jewish life, there has been a fairly steady stream of people, American Jews looking less and less different, right? A lower percentage, from, if you go from like the early 20th century, a far lower percentage today wears garments that makes it clear that they're Jews, right? Wears a yarmulke or wears the tzitzis, the strings hanging out of their shirt. These kinds of things that mark you as different. Observance has not gone away. There are vibrant Orthodox communities and traditional communities and other observant communities in the United States, but that part of American Jewish life over the 20th century sort of reduced. These things that sort of clearly marked Jews as different kind of went away, and admission to the club became possible in some places, not in others. I kind of forget where we started the question.
Right. No. I mean, it directly ties into that evolution, right? It directly ties into how it is that two things. We're actually dealing with two different things at the same time that are easily conflated, but I think both equally important. It is the evolution, so to speak, of whiteness in America, and then also the political political function of different voices that are not traditionally white, based on America's standard, based on the history of America, who then become champions of whiteness and become like that front line, that firewall, like Candace Owens is from the Black community, like Ben-Shapiro is from the Jewish community. Like there's always going to be someone who's a collaborator with what the rest of us who are African American. And then I can imagine in the Jewish community, we stand back and we're aghast. We're completely blown away by how these voices become the champions of the very thing that oppressed many of us for hundreds of years.
Yeah, I mean, with Shapiro, the element of it that's so striking, it seems to be this retreat into what he calls Judeo-Christianity.
Yes.
Right. And that's his code. It's not, it doesn't just mean white, but it certainly cues a lot of whiteness, right, when he says that. And it sort of oddly and really actively distances Judaism from Islam, which in practice is no more justifiable than distancing it from Christianity. And clearly, I mean, if you look at in practice, I mean, there's similarities between all of these religions, but the sort of natural function of Christianity is a very sort of direct denial of Judaism.
Right.
Many ways we could talk theologically or legalistically if we want to. So he makes that move, right? And that move aligns him with all sorts of people, which makes for funny alliances. Right. Makes for very uncomfortable ones.
Strange bedfellows. Like he's in league with a John Hagee, right? He's in league with. Go ahead.
So the John Hagee one is on the one hand like theologically nuts, right? Because John Hagee thinks that Ben-Shapiro will either, I don't know, he'll be like eviscerated in the second coming of Jesus, or I don't know exactly it. But like he clearly believes that the Jews will be replaced, right? Like that is the John Hagee theology, I think, more or less uncontroversially. It also aligns him, he's been big on this pro-life stuff,
right?
Which, I mean, and I'm not going to speak as an expert on traditional Jewish approaches to abortion, but I will say they are very distinct from like evangelical ones, like extremely, very, very distinct. There's disagreements in many ways, but the notion of life starts at conception does not have a traditional Jewish background.
I think this is worth a segue, right? Let's take a sidestep because this is a huge issue. I read a thread. I did not catch the name of the woman who did the thread, but it really referenced the Talmud and how life does not clearly doesn't begin at conception according to the Jewish faith. I'm not sure. I don't want to misquote, but I'm sure you can correct me that it begins at birth. Am I correct in that, or when does it?
Yeah. In terms of like personhood, it would. Again, it's hard because. And I actually read the thread that you're referring to, and it's important to note, just like with any tradition, there are disagreements.
Right.
But I think that things we can say confidently is that the notion of conception equaling personhood for the whatever you call the little group of cells, right, the embryo or whatever, right? That is not something that Orthodox Jews have in any large number been committed to in the way that evangelicals are.
Right.
And most of the traditional ideas are far closer to sort of, I would say, American liberal perspectives in many ways. I mean, it's complicated. I mean, I'll say some things that I can tell you 100%, not for the purpose of sort of teaching the Jewish perspective on abortion, because I don't really feel comfortable in that. But I can give some things that may or may not surprise, which sort of should put a fissure in that Judeo-Christianity. I mean, we think of Christian fundamentalists being sort of against birth control, right? Birth control is a bad thing.
Right.
Rabbis prescribe birth control all the time.
Oh my. I did not know that.
Rabbis don't give prescriptions, right? But like you go to them and you say, like, I'm trying to deal with this issue. Birth control is it's so much so. I mean, this is this kind of gets into the weeds of Jewish marital practice, but this is, I don't know. Ben, you decide if you want to use this, right? I'm going to tell you something that's true. It's going to be funny because on the one hand, it's going to show that birth control is part of Jewish tradition. On the other hand, it's going to maybe seem backwards to a lot of people. But traditional Jewish couples have a pattern of when they do and do not engage in intercourse.
Okay.
And you don't engage in intercourse during the woman's period and directly thereafter. So it's completely permissible for a woman to engage in birth control so that she's not on her wedding night, for example, that she is not in the period where she can't consummate the wedding or whatever. There's like a lot of uses like this, right? Or if there's a health concern for the mother and getting pregnant is dangerous, birth control is completely acceptable for for most traditional Jews.
If I were to summarize what I just heard in one word, you guys are pretty practical with these things, right?
Yeah.
And clearly that is directly at odds with the neurotic impracticality of evangelicalism in this country. And quite honestly, like if you get into evangelical circles and you actually go to their churches, you go to their events and you interact with their young people, they don't even live by their own standards, but that's an entirely different conversation. But everything that you just described to me speaks to practicality.
Yeah, 100%. I mean, which isn't to say that, it depends on different communities. There are certainly religious, traditional Jewish communities where people have tons and tons of kids, but that is not because birth control is never an option generally. It's generally because they believe it's good to be fruitful and multiply. Now, I'm not going to speak. There are certainly some people who have different perspectives on this. However, there are many times in which the most religious person you can go to who knows the most about this will say birth control is the right choice for a strict observant religious woman or family or man, or vasectomy or various options, right? It's not maybe the ideal in that there's a lot of positive weight placed on having and raising children and having big families.
Right.
However, like the idea that the every sperm is sacred, right? To quote Monty Python, right? That is not not a Jewish ideal.
Right. Well, that's not even the evangelical ideal, right? If you look at the porn, at the rate of porn consumption in the Bible Belt,
it might be an ideal, right?
Right. It's not something that they live by any measure.
No, that's for sure. But that's not. Yeah. That, and so and which is to say, like, I'm not. I want to be clear. I am not saying it's better. I really am not at all saying that is better.
I'll say it's better. I don't care.
No, but you can say what you want, and like what I want to say is that when Ben-Shapiro says like Judeo-Christian and talks about abortion, like I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
Right.
Because it cannot be the evangelical Jerry Falwell version.
Right.
He's definitely not talking about the complicated Talmudic version. I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
So that's an even better example, right? So we could talk about his being closer in league with the Richard Spencers of the world, right? But then also like just almost theologically, like you're saying, like he is literally representing a version of his faith that is at odds with his faith, and he's doing it for political ends.
Yeah, I think that's right. I mean, which isn't. I mean, it gets whatever. I want to be nuanced, right? I want to say there's certainly a way that you could personally square these things, but what you cannot do is make a blanket statement and suggest that there's this natural alliance. And the reality is, and we can get to bigger. The natural alliance is fully utilitarian and not at all having to do with values.
All right, so let's jump off there. The reason I want to unpack more so the reason of why you mentioned it's very utilitarian. And I think there was one article, and I believe the woman who wrote it was in The Nation, and I hopefully I can get the link and put it in the description. But she mentioned something that I think I recall you mentioning, that even in these instances where you see a very rare, very small group of Jewish people aligning with powers that you would think are an anathema to them, like just kind of antithetical to what they believe, it's generally for the purposes of obtaining power and in hopes that they are protected from the worst case scenario. Like they feel like this is the best way for them to protect their interests.
No, I think that so I think if we're going to have this discussion, it has to go fairly far back, and we're going to have to do some sort of historical glossing, right? It's not going to be in depth. And then there's really two things I would point to, right? There is a history of trying to live as a constantly threatened and often attacked and not infrequently genocide aimed at minority, right? And there is a set of tactics that develop over, in this case, millennia that relate to that. Then there's this question of Israel, but Israel ties into that, right? Israel is part of that process. It's not a separate question. And it's hard because we're talking about literally thousands and thousands of years. It might be easiest to just sort of pick a moment. Right. If you and I'll do that from something that sort of at least personally has, at least family relevance to give some perspective. Right. So let's just look at my grandparents in Russia, or Soviet, that place that would become the Soviet Union, places that spoke Russian or partially Russia or Latvia, Ukraine, sort of where my family came from in the early 20th century. Right. And, look at the situation that they are in. Right. Where are they? Right. Jews have been chased from everywhere. There is a rise of extreme violence aimed at Jews in these spaces. And what you have is, sort of this situation where the status quo seems untenable. Right. It seems like it leads to death and destruction. And people start developing theories, particularly in the early 20th century, because of the situation and because of sort of the intellectual mode of the time, about how to deal with this.
Right.
Right. And there are, a number of schools of thought. Right. How can the Jews survive in particularly Europe, particularly Eastern Europe? But obviously, as we come to learn, Western Europe, this becomes equally important in the 20th century. how to survive, right? And so different schools of thought emerge, right? Assimilation, right, is an option, right?
Yeah.
And it looks like it's going really well in some places, right? Like if you read books from German Jews in the 19 teens, they're talking about how this is the place where Jewish life and culture is flourishing and will finally make it, right? Obviously, that has a very that turns out to have been a problematic approach, right?
Yeah.
There's conversion, right, which certainly historically has worked for many groups of people, many groups of Jews, not all, but there are all sorts of places where Jews converted to, sort of gave up their traditions. That's sort of self-disappearing, right? That is an option.
Yeah.
Communism, right? I mean, if you look at the communist movement in the early 20th century in Russia and elsewhere, right? Lots and lots of Jews say the way to survive is to totally disrupt the
entire system.
The entire system, right? And hope that in doing so, you shake anti-Semitism out of it. I mean, that didn't play out great for Russian Jews, for example, for Soviet Jews, right? That sort of option does not look as good in retrospect. And there's nationalism, right? This is what Zionism comes from. The idea that the only survival tactic is to cease being a minority. These are all just different. Find a place where you cease to be a minority. These are all different tactics. Yeah. And all of them involve collaborating with somebody outside of your community who's more powerful than you.
Can you? I want you to pause there really quickly.
Yeah.
Because at the same exact time, as Jewish people across the globe were trying to figure out those questions, like you said, in the early 19 teens, in the black community in the United States, the same questions literally at the same exact time. You had the A. Philip Randolph, you had the Martin Delany way before them in the 19th century, but then you had W.E.B. Du Bois. You had the question of nationalism versus assimilation. Not much in terms of if I were to find a parallel the parallel with conversion really would be would be the assimilation track of becoming more like the white community here,
culturally
converting, exactly. And so at the same exact time these questions were being asked in the Jewish community, they were being asked in the African American community, and I want you to finish because there's one point I want to make at the end. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. So, I mean, I think that both looking at the similarities and differences there are really crucial. But the point that I'm making is that and I'm talking about a very specific European Jewish community. There are communities all over the world which had different, sometimes similar, sometimes different, very different challenges. But if we look at the people I'm discussing, right, the one thing you couldn't do is sort of strike out on your own. Right, it was very clear that there needed to be some agreement with some broader power structure for Jews to feel like they were likely to survive. Right, so that could mean basically collaborating with the local church, which is oppressing the Jews, but you get on their good side and hopefully your family comes out okay. It could mean sort of finding the people leading the communist movement and sort of putting aside your individuality, your communal values towards those. It could include going to London and begging the British for greater Jewish immigration to Palestine in order to create a Jewish state there. But in any case, the options felt by people in those communities were that sitting still was going to lead you to death. My family mostly came to the United States, right? And, in doing so, kind of forged a middle path, right? And this is where American Jews come from, where, you go to a place where you basically try to delay the question. You say, who else will take us and let us be us? And hopefully the other shoe doesn't drop, right? And, a lot of American Jews would say America has fulfilled that role. More paranoid people will point to those German discussions in the 19 teens and say, never be too secure in yourself.
Right.
It's a lesson learned not once, not twice, but dozens and dozens of times.
So
many places Jews have flourished and then ultimately been rejected.
So here's my observation of the utilitarian view of people of any race, any ethnicity, faith, aligning with powers that don't really fit, right?
Yeah.
It makes sense. Those questions clearly make sense in the early 20th century. They absolutely make sense. And you can't really, even in hindsight, you can't really question those choices, because those are difficult choices that had to be made in the context of the time. I don't think Ben-Shapiro or Candace Owens are afforded that type of scenario, because there's literally no reason, with the exception of you gave the extreme case of people who really firmly believe today, or hold the same fear today in the United States that they held with regard to Jewish people in Germany in the 19-teens. With that small exception, there's literally no excuse for, in my opinion, for there to be a utilitarian explanation for why a person like Ben-Shapiro would align with white supremacists and Nazi powers.
Well, you use the word Nazi, and I will say that from my perspective, I don't know if those, I don't know if that terminology is not mine. It's yours, and I'm not fighting it. I'm just there are elements like the Judeo-Christian thing I went over where I see what you mean there. Like, I just want to leave that like in your words, not mine, not to fight.
Right. No. You listen. I mean, and so
it's not.
I mean,
not my place.
But here's a reason why I use that language, and then we can unpack it, and you can refute it by all means. When there's the white nationalist agenda in this country has embedded in it naturally neo-Nazis. It's just it is the natural place and home for neo-Nazism in this country, and not just in terms of a political party, not just in terms of Donald Trump, but literally the ideology itself. When you protect white supremacy in this country, when you become a buffer and a shield for it, you are protecting the undercurrent. It may not be a very large percentage, but you are protecting the you are like the tip of the spear, and behind you are some neo-Nazis. And so while Ben-Shapiro may 100% and obviously never believe that he is aligned with neo-Nazis, would never support them outright, or in his mind would never want to support them indirectly, by him becoming a shield and a buffer, it's almost like Candace Owens, right? Candace Owens would never admit that she is the front line, and behind her, maybe far behind her, is the Klan, the KKK, literally, are aligned with the same ideologies that she's protecting.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. I mean, Shapiro's relationship to Trump is a little more complicated, but I hear what you're saying in that the he becomes a voice to give succor to people who are, I mean, particularly Islamophobic, but also racist, 100%, and probably. I mean, I wonder. I mean, you'd think. I guess I don't know. I wonder what the sort of anti-Semitic listenership he has is. He's pretty out there, but like with his Jewishness. But I don't know. I'd be interested.
You know what? I honestly, I've actually had a chance to meet these neo-Nazis right in person down here in Georgia, and it was an experience, and without a shadow of a doubt, they hate Ben-Shapiro, right? I doubt any of them listen to Ben-Shapiro. That's the greatest irony of this, though. But they are, when we talk about this convergence of white supremacy in this country, it involves neo-Nazis without question, in my opinion. I just don't see this rise of white supremacy in this country not involving neo-Nazis. We literally saw the uptick. I think there's a 17% increase since the election of Donald Trump in neo-Nazi organizations specifically. And so it's like, once you are aligned, to me, it may be a loose confederation, but they are in league, whether he would ever want to admit it or not.
Yeah, no, it's interesting. I think it's good. I think the notion of loose confederation and sort of overlapping Venn diagrams is really important. I mean, there's no question that the Ben-Shapiro view of the world, while in certain aspects obviously being extremely in opposition to a neo-Nazi movement, certainly it does give sort of intellectual heft to some platforms of that movement. So a
little too loose for you, though.
Well, I mean, it's like one of those things. I get really nervous with the word Nazi if you don't literally mean somebody wants to round up and kill Jews. But maybe you do in this case, right? I mean, we've seen examples. where
people I haven't given you a chance to actually respond in full, but I just want to say this. This is literally why I feel there's no excuse for Shapiro, the Candace Owens of this world, for anyone from a minority community to be the front for this conservative movement, which unfortunately, and I want to be fair to conservatives, there is a conservative movement that is completely separated and not connected to white supremacy. But the way it has emerged in American history, the way it has emerged today is a confluence of they're synonymous almost with conservatism and white supremacy in this country, particularly in the form of Donald Trump. So for me, it's like, I know when I say I'm a socialist, I know full well the baggage that's behind me, right? I know that there's Marxist Leninists who would go way further than I would ever want to go. But I know who I'm not in league with would be the Klan. I'm not in league with people who literally want to destroy me simply because I'm black.
Yeah, no, you're right. If we sort of stipulate that these are loose connections, but they sort of have reinforcing values in certain places where they overlap. I do think that's right. I mean, I think part of what you're pointing to, honestly, which I think I agree, is this. Shapiro's really committed to the idea that there's a distinction between sort of general conservative American views of race and culture and sort of the Trumpist version of it, right? He wants to sort of say there's like a fairly clean break there. And I think that's how he sort of says he's not aligning with these people. And I think your view, and I think I'm very sympathetic to it, is that, Trump is just sort of like the steroid version of the previous thing. Yeah. Right. Trump did not come in and invent new stuff, right? He just sort of let people say the stuff that used to be quiet loudly but was always there. Yeah. And if you stipulate that, if you say that's true, and you say, well, Shapiro's cheering on, is trying to cheer on, some distinction without a difference, basically, right? He's trying to hail a conservatism which has always been racist, has always been, white supremacist in some way, and wants to distance himself from the overt manifestations of that. And Trump, that's that. I think I'd want to think hard, but I do think that. Well,
that's what we're here for, man. We're here.
I think there's something to it. I'll say that much.
So, and actually, we're getting to the question that I started the episode with, because I think if we dig a little deeper, it's been a while. It's been a while since I did a show, so if I say something that, feel free to stop and press back like you did, push back rather, like you did. But here's the thing. Here's what Ben Shapiro represents more than anything else. He represents and he protects more than anything else this idea of Western civilization being superior to anything else, and the otherification of Islam, for sure.
For sure. I was going to go there. Absolutely.
Right. Yeah. And so the overlap, it's almost like, there's an overlap. Sure, you have these racist organizations that definitely hate Jews, but this is and hate black people, and they would
really hate Muslims,
right? But they hate Muslims more than anything else, right? This idea that this is where this racist, this is Islamophobic, this anti-Semitic spirit has evolved. I have no other way of right now of the ideology. Okay, the ideology has evolved, right? It's like, we hate colored folks. Yes, we hate Jewish people, but you know what? If you will hate Islam, and you will hate Muslims as much as we do, we'll give you a respite for this era.
No, that's right. And let's fold it back into the previous story. So you, I think, had correctly, noted that Ben Shapiro himself, does not seem parallel to my grandparents and great grandparents in Russia. and that their lives were being directly threatened, and whatever
Absolutely.
decisions they were going to make, they were going to have some sort of they're going to have to sell out to somebody or beg somebody to take them in and try to get on board with their, if they came to America, they were going to have to become Americans in some way or another, and there would be compromise. And Shapiro is not in that situation. He is 2-3 generations later, and clearly he is somebody who can express his Jewishness without feeling threat.
Mm-hmm.
And that's absolutely right.
Yeah,
that is absolutely right. This is where Israel becomes part of the story, right? And that is that if you break down so me and him, I don't know what towns and villages his family was from, but I suggest they're probably rather similar to my own, right? So our families came here, right? And over time, roughly about the other half went to Israel, right? And so when he is talking about survival, it's not that literal one that our grandparents were talking about, right? It's a national survival. And then here's where, you have to decide which you don't have to agree with his detailing of the facts, but I do think this is where it comes from, this Islamophobia, right? Is the idea, well, fine, he was lucky and his parents came here, but they could have ended up dead, or they could have ended up in Mandate Palestine, right? And this is just a fluke of history, which way you went. And he believes that the other part of either his family or his nation that went the other way is in that same threatened situation. And he is willing to collaborate with basically anybody to do what he thinks will ensure the safety of that side of the family, that side of the nation, right? Now you can. I mean, I do disagree insofar as I think the people he aligns with ultimately make it less likely that that side of the nation does well and survives. I mean, that's where we, in other words, we agree, me and him, with the diagnosis. I think in that, I'm really worried about the survival of fully 50% of the Jewish people in the world. I do not agree that signing up with John Hagee and the world's greatest Islamophobes and a bunch of racists is the way to ensure their safety. And I've got lots of allies over in Israel who agree with me. Yeah. They just unfortunately can't ever put together a government. But you know what I mean? Like that is where that piece locks together, right? So he's safe. And he doesn't have to collaborate locally. He doesn't. And maybe he just is looking for a reason to. But, the way that it can tie in is sort of that traumatic history. And then you have, to his mind, a situation in which, yet again, there's a reason that we need to sell out to a powerful group of people who may deep down hate us. Right. I mean, you look at the friends that Bibi makes in Eastern Europe, Orban and the like. I mean, these are no friends of the Jewish people, right? But they are enemies of Muslims, right? Enemy of my enemy kind of stuff. And I think that that's a big part of the Shapiro story. And then, of course, another part of the story is, we talk about, so me and you, we have two discussions that me and you have, right? One is about sort of Middle East, religion, Israel, these kinds of politics. And the other is media and media lanes.
Yes, sir.
Right? Like a place to get an audience. Yeah. And he is able to put these together because there's a lane for him, right? Yep. There's an audience there. Yeah. And so, the Marxist in me says, well, this is too much to be a coincidence, right? It turns out that his pockets can get lined by embracing sort of the most scarred and maybe not fully thought out aspects of his psyche. Right. I don't know.
No,
does that rant make any sense?
No, it literally, because you went where I was going to go. The last part of this obviously is the opportunity, right? He gets I believe he gets between 150 and 200,000 downloads of his podcast every day. 2 million followers on, I believe it's either Twitter or it's on Facebook. He, had billionaires invest in his company to do exactly.
And he's got nothing, Ben. He's not a special person.
Well,
I mean, some people get that because they're just so brilliant and talented. And I mean, I don't. He's not. He's got some talent, clearly, but
he's a performer. What I would give him, he knows how to play to an audience, and and he also knows how to take advantage. Think of it this way: if you had no qualms whatsoever with embarrassing your students and putting it on video, Like, that's literally what Ben Shapiro does. He goes to get undergrad students and makes a spectacular stand, as though that 19-year-old feminist represents an entirety of feminism. And that's what he likes to do. So, but I agree with you.
Right. Which has the ugliest history that we've given what we're discussing, right? Like, I mean, just the idea for a guy who's so invested in his Jewish identity to be doing that kind of stuff, at best shows a horrific lack of self-reflection.
Yeah.
Right. I mean, the idea of drawing out outliers and using them to stand in for groups, right?
No, but
what
that
could be worse?
I mean, that's literally. But I mean, hell, that's what they've done to the black community.
Sure,
time immemorial. That's the technique, right? That's the vilification, right? That's the vilification using outliers, right? And then obviously the pushback against you doing the same technique to them. That's where we are. But the media lane can't be overstated whatsoever. No. I mean, he's literally a multimillionaire because of this. And I think at the end of the day, I think that's the driving force more than anything else. Because like you said, even with, there are, and I can't speak to this, obviously you can, but they're literally the thought, there's other schools of thought with regard to the preservation of Israel, without being in league with the very people who would later on want to destroy you anyway. And so while there is, you actually made a really good case for the global utilitarian view in terms of why he does what he does and others do what they do. But then there's other school of thoughts, right? But schools of thought rather. But the best explanation of them all is the fact that if you are willing to work with and for and I use white supremacy just kind of like a catch-all, but I mean it's a very broad category. But if you're willing to work for and with the status quo power structure of the globe, of this quote unquote Western civilization, in the United States, conservatism, white Christian men, if you're willing to be the front and cover for them, there is a very lucrative lane for you that really there's nothing on the left can even remotely rival.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, especially, I mean, if we do focus on, this element of the Jewishness element of it, it's so striking, it's comical, right? I mean, there are probably more nuanced political or varying levels of nuance, political commentators and magazines and podcasts and whatever. There are probably more of those by Jews than there are Jews, right? Like it's a
I don't know how that math adds up, but it makes sense.
I say to point out, it's an incredible. You're not gonna. Nobody gets rich,
right?
Like attending to that. I mean, if that were his interest of being nuanced about issues of being nuanced about Israel, right? There is no lane there, right? Like there are tons of magazines and people writing, trying to like come up with different perspectives on it. If you're trying to attract an audience that like is nuanced about these things, it's like largely either people who are into foreign policy, a lot of Jewish people, like there's no way, you can't make $1 there, right? But if you can expand, if you can dumb it down and like shape it in the kind of ideological ways you describe, right? Yeah, sure. Then you've got literally, billions of people across the world who might be potential customers.
Yeah.
Collaborators. Collaborators. Right?
Collaborators.
Yeah, I mean, like. Yeah, that's right. And I mean, I would think Candace Owens, probably something rather similar, right? There's plenty of nuanced black voices talking about complicated issues, but she can't make any money being one of those. She's not good at it, and there's a ton more like making white people feel better about their racism.
Oh man,
right? Like that's good money.
In a way, I feel unfulfilled that our episode kind of dovetailed back to the obvious, right? No, but it's the truth, right? Out of everything that we discussed, right, which I think it's worthwhile discussing, and I think it's worthwhile. One of the reasons it's worthwhile discussing is because I'm working on an article. I'm doing some research now about this evolution of whiteness in America. Now it is it is, I don't know the word yet, but now it is broad enough to include collaborators and in a very lucrative way for those collaborators, right? So it's this evolution of whiteness when at one time it would not include other Europeans, right? But now it includes people of other faiths, other races, ethnicities, cultures, orientation. It's so long as that person is willing to protect that original whiteness, that original power structure that Bill O'Reilly called, in the United States at least, America being run by white Christian men. If you're willing to protect that, then you are welcomed into that that definition of whiteness.
No, you're right, and I think it does tie in wonderfully because I mean, to me, for with Shapiro, there's ways in which I disagree, sort of like with his, I disagree vehemently with his policy proposals, some of which are sort of comically ridiculous, and some of which I disagree with in terms of Israel and these things. But where like fundamentally it's lining up with what you're saying is this he's going to sell books by doubling down on Judeo-Christianity, right? He's going to tie into that majority group and act as though there's no tension there. Right. And that seems to be the same kind of thing. When I hear you talking, I think Dinesh D'Souza, right?
Yeah.
I think Candace Owens, right? And it's sort of, basically it's universalizing a certain whiteness, right? A Christian whiteness generally, right? Where you say that these traditional values are universalists and like sort of are the best that people have come up with, but really what they are is just the dominant culture's ability to
maintain power,
and do its own self-judgment. Right, like to consider, they make the canon, right? They decide which books are the great books, and so all their books happen to be great books. They decide that their values are they both make them, and then they are the judges, right? And the Shapiro move of focusing on Judeo-Christianity as though that is not going to basically overwrite the Judeo part, right? The Christian. Literally, that's what Christianity is about, right? And that's not to say anything about it on a judgment level. It's literally there to surpass and replace Judaism, right? And I think that's nicely parallel to what you're talking about. People being allowed to be in the club as long as they're willing to be overwritten. So I like that.
Yeah. And I guess the next obvious question for you and I would be like, you being devoutly Jewish and me being relatively devoutly Christian.
Well, we're all relatives.
How is it that we get along so well? But that's an episode that we have been talking about doing for a long time. It's one of those episodes like I kind of want to approach with a whole lot of research and being able to not recall an article, but actually have that article handy. So that'll be the next time we get together. Let's tackle that.
Yeah. No, I mean, I'm very, very, very happy to. I think we could get each other into all kinds of uncomfortable places, which hopefully would be good listening.
I hope so. Matt, thanks so much for joining me, man. It's always a pleasure.
No, I appreciate the opportunity to speak at some length and work some ideas out.
That's it for today. Thanks for hanging out with me. More content to come, video content coming soon. So be sure to continue to support. Hey, patrons, you are the real MVP. You all rode with me through the good times and the bad times. So why don't the rest of you become a part of that family? Go to patreon.com/the BPD show for today's bonus content. More conversation with me and Professor Sienkiewicz. Thanks so much, everyone. Have a great day. We'll see you next time.
The Benjamin Dixon Show is only possible with listener support. Go to www.thebenjamindixonshow.com to register for our blog and join the Progressive Army.